Greetings, YouTube. At one time, Earth was primordial soup, and from that soup arose single-cell organisms. And these organisms divided and mutated and changed over time. And eventually, some of them achieved sexual reproduction. Some didn't, and we still have some of those asexual reproducing creatures in our world today. And there was an advantage to sexual reproduction in that by swapping genetic material, it shuffled the decks, if you will, and gave an evolutionary advantage to certain creatures over others. The asexual reproducing creatures tend to be very niche ecosystem exploiters. They're not in competition a great deal. But that shuffling of the deck meant more traits were passed from generation to generation. Those that had poor traits kind of drifted out of the gene pool, and those with positive traits continued to breed. And that's how we had the evolutionary tree of life. Part of that, in the case of the more advanced life forms, the ones with spines and things like that, particularly amongst the mammals, is that we have asymmetrical reproduction, where the egg is vastly larger than the sperm, far more complex, and where the bulk of the reproductive process takes place. The sperm enters the egg, fertilizes the egg, sperm's done. Sperm has done its job. It's delivered its genetic package, and everything from that point on is taken over by the egg. This has an evolutionary advantage for the egg, because being a larger, more complex structure, it has more survivability on its own. I mean, not on its own, but you get my point. It's got redundancy built in. It's got a food supply, things like that. Whereas the sperm is literally very disposable. The one that did its job in fertilizing that egg was probably just a single sperm out of a million, and the other 999,999 are gone. But sperm can be reproduced quickly, daily, whereas eggs are a bigger investment in the creature's biological process. So why am I talking about this? That asymmetrical breeding process that we have come to know, that women carry the pregnancy, that they are the ones that bear the fetus, which eventually is a baby, for 9 months, or approximately 9 months, while the male, their involvement in the process takes a couple of minutes, and then they're done. They can walk away. They can, in theory, impregnate dozens of women in the time that takes one woman to carry that baby to term. All right? So, that's a problem in the modern world. In the modern world, both parents need to support that child, and that's the support in our capitalist system is through monetary means. It takes money to raise a baby into a child and into adulthood. It may take a village, but that village is going to have to chip in money to pull it off. And whenever the topic of abortion comes up, I will always hear people say, well, if women have the right to decide whether they're going to carry a fetus to term, that males should have this decision whether they should pay child support if she decides to keep that fetus. And the complaint isn't with women in my book. The complaint that these people are saying is with the fact that we have asymmetrical reproduction in humans. It is not that woman's fault that biology has burdened her with the process of carrying that fetus to term. It is a literal burden. She has to lug weight around for 9 months, undergoing a process which can be life-changing, life-threatening, that can change her biological systems forever. And yet there are men that want to just wash their hands and walk away. And we as a society, for the most part in the West, have said, no, you can't do that. You have to pay towards the raising of that child. And I have to agree with that. Particularly because many males want to have some kind of involvement with that child, even if they are not involved with the mother. Now, people will say, well, in an ideal situation, the parents would be together. I will not say that's the ideal situation. There are times when parents shouldn't be together. There are times when parents being together is worse than either parent taking care of the child alone. So I don't think that ideal situation actually exists in the real world. I never have. I know I come from a dysfunctional family where I would have been far better off if my father had walked away as soon as he'd impregnated my mother. Far better off. But I wasn't. And I think that if he had been required to pay child support, though back in the 60s, I don't know what the child support laws were like, to tell you the truth. I don't know if he could have just walked away completely, maybe. I'm not sure. But I think that you have a responsibility to that child. That it benefits society at large if you maintain that responsibility to that child. I realize that that is a controversial topic. I really do. I get it. But it's not the woman's fault that our biology involves an asymmetric reproductive system. If there was a 50% chance every time a heterosexual couple had sex where either person could get pregnant, the laws would be a whole lot different, and I can guarantee you men would not have this opinion. If there was a risk every single time they had sex that they could get pregnant, our concerns for birth control and abortion would be, I think, far more equitable. As the old saying goes, if men could get pregnant, there would be an abortion clinic on every corner. And while flippant, there is a kernel of truth there. It's really easy to be dismissive about what a woman has to go through when a man never ever has to go through it. And being responsible for that child is something I think everyone benefits from when both parents are involved, at least financially, if not as parents. And some families have a single parent. Some families have two, some have three, some have five. It doesn't matter how many parents. But I think it benefits if people are engaged and involved in the process. That, to me, is the most important part. That the people are involved, that they are engaged, that they are part of the process, that they want to raise that child. And if you don't, I still think that you should have a financial responsibility to that child. Raising a child is incredibly expensive. I think with the last estimate, it was like $220,000 or $230,000 to raise a child from birth until the age of 18. You should not be burdening a single woman with that if a man wants to walk away. That's not fair. This goes beyond just the issue of bodily autonomy. A lot of this has to do with the fact that none of us have control, that our reproduction is asymmetric. The man's involvement is brief and relatively easy physically, whereas the woman's part of the process is incredibly burdensome and dangerous. And I think it's only fair that everybody chips in that process. And if the father has custody of the child or children, the mother should pay child support. This was completely equitable to me. Whoever the primary caregiver is should be the one receiving child support. And in the unlikely event that is absolute, perfectly split down the middle, then I guess you're splitting the responsibility and you can split the money. But that's probably a very unusual circumstance. I can't imagine it happens very often where it's exactly split down the middle. Because that's really not, I think, fair to a child to make them spend 50% of their time in one place and 50% of their time in another place. I think that's kind of weird. That's just me. And I'm hoping the conversation we can have about this will be civil. I'm hoping. I'm going to throw out the olive branch and say, please, let's discuss this like adults. Because I think that's how we're going to get something solved. How we're going to arrive at maybe a new insight that we don't have as individuals at the moment. And that's a good thing. So, tell me, what is your thoughts on the fact that the human species has an asymmetric reproductive system?